The operation was supposed to be simple. Captain Aaron Hawley moved through the broken corridors of the core and relay station with his mixed unit squad, boots crunching over shattered metal and glass. The lights flickered, but the path ahead was clear. Enemy resistance had already collapsed. Orders were clear: secure the data core, erase all remaining threats, and leave before reinforcements arrived. This kind of mission had been repeated thousands of times during the Long War. Everyone knew their role. Everyone followed the chain of command. Everything was calm, controlled, and efficient. Too efficient. And that was the first warning sign. Commander Zelra's voice echoed calmly through the comms, translated into crisp human speech. Sweep complete in 5 minutes. Transport inbound shortly after. Her tone carried no doubt, no fear. She had led dozens of successful operations, and this was just another line on the mission log. The squad moved like a machine, covering angles, checking corners, trusting years of training. Aaron stayed near the back, his rifle lowered but ready, his eyes scanning what the others ignored. Dust settled slowly in the air, drifting like ash after a fire that had already burned out. That's when Aaron saw it. Tucked behind a collapsed console, half hidden by twisted wiring, was a small shape that did not belong. Not a weapon. Not a soldier. A child. A corn child, no older than 6 or 7 by human standards. Its thin body shook as it tried to breathe, chest rising unevenly, skin pale and cracked. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Its eyes fluttered open for a moment, dull with pain and fear, before closing again. Contact. Rear section, Aaron said quietly. The reaction was immediate. Plasma rifles lifted in perfect unison. Targeting systems locked on. Corporal Nesh already had a firing solution calculated. Enemy survivor, he said flatly. Authorization to eliminate. Negative, Aaron snapped, stepping forward without thinking. The squad froze. Silence. We filled the corridor, broken only by the faint, ragged breathing of the child. Commander Zelra turned slowly, her tall frame blocking the flickering lights behind her. Captain Hawley, she said, voice sharp now, step aside. That is a future enemy combatant. Aaron shook his head. It's a child. It's dying. Protocol is clear, Zelra replied. No survivors, especially not enemy offspring. Protocol didn't account for this, Aaron said, kneeling beside the small body. Checked quickly, the way a medic would. Broken bones, severe dehydration, deep cuts, untreated for days. It can live, he said. If we help it. You are disobeying a direct order, Zelra warned. Aaron looked up at her, then back at the child. Then write it in your report. I'm not leaving it here. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Aaron lifted the child carefully into his arms. It let out a weak sound, more a breath than a cry, and pressed instinctively against his chest. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. The walk back to the transport was silent. No one spoke. No one argued anymore. The squad moved forward, but the distance between Aaron and the others felt wider than the corridor itself. The child lay limp in his arms, light as broken equipment, its breathing shallow and uneven. Every step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the ship, the medical bay doors stayed shut. Regulations flashed across the display. Enemy care. Prohibited. Voluntary extraction violation. Aaron didn't wait for permission. He turned away and carried the child to his quarters, sealing the door behind him. The days that followed blurred together. Outside, the ship continued its routines. Inside the small room, time slowed. Aaron cleaned wounds with careful hands that had once been steady only in combat. He crushed ration packs into thin paste so the child could swallow. He wrapped broken limbs and changed bandages again and again. At night, the child cried out in a language Aaron didn't understand, but he understood the meaning. Fear, pain, loneliness. Aaron stayed awake through it, all sitting on the floor, speaking softly even though he knew the words didn't matter. By the 3rd day, the child could sit up. By the 5th, he could eat without help. By the 7th, the wounds had closed into faint scars. Aaron started calling the child Nova in his mind, because it had survived when it shouldn't have. On the morning of the tribunal, he put on his formal uniform and gently cleaned Nova's face. Whatever punishment waited for him, he was ready to accept it. He never made it to the courtroom. The alarms screamed through the ship. Red lights flooded the halls. Aaron rushed to the viewport, Nova clutching his leg. Space was filled with ships, more than he could count. An enemy fleet, surrounding them completely. The intercom crackled with disbelief. Enemy armada detected. 100 vessels. The ship braced for impact. But the attack never came. Instead, a single small craft moved forward, glowing white. A signal of peace. Moments later, a message arrived. They were asking for Captain Aaron Hawley. They were offering an exchange. In the docking bay, armed guards lined the walls as 2 massive Koran leaders stepped forward. Their eyes locked on Nova. The child broke free and ran. The reunion was raw and wordless. Claws traced healed wounds. Breaths shook. Then the female leader turned to Aaron. Slowly, she knelt before him. "We came for war," she said through the translator. "But you gave our child mercy. You chose compassion over orders." She stood and raised her voice. "By my authority, this war is over." Months later, Aaron stood in a quiet garden on the enemy's homeworld, now open to all. Nova laughed among human children. The tribunal was gone. The war was gone. And the galaxy remembered one simple truth. Humanity is not who you are. It is what you choose. The peace did not arrive loudly. There were no grand celebrations at first. No victory parades. No banners raised in the stars. It came quietly, in signed agreements, in open prison doors, in fleets that turned around and never returned. Union prisoners came home by the thousands, thin but alive, carrying stories no one would ever fully record. Entire battlefronts went silent almost overnight. For the first time in 73 years, children on both sides grew up without learning, with the sound of orbital fire before they learned how to speak. Aaron returned to duty, though his role was no longer the same. He was no longer sent to the front lines. Instead, he sat in long chambers with diplomats, soldiers, and historians, explaining a single decision again and again. He never dressed it up. He never called it heroic. He always said the same thing. "I just saw a child," some nodded. Some looked away, but the words stayed with them. On VRA Prime, the old battlefields were slowly transformed. Weapons yards became gardens, watchtowers became schools. At the center of one such place, crystal flowers grew in patterns shaped by both human and Vrax's hands. They called it the Peace Garden, not because peace was easy, but because it had to be tended every day. Aaron stood there months later, watching Nova chase human children between the glowing plants, laughing in a voice no longer afraid. The scars were still there, faint lines on gray skin, reminders of a life almost lost. Nova looked back at Aaron and waved, eyes bright, alive with a future that once should never have existed. No court ever summoned Aaron again. The tribunal file disappeared without explanation. In its place, new protocols were written, not about weapons or targets, but about mercy, about restraint, about the moments where orders must pause long enough for conscience to speak. The war had ended not because of superior firepower, or clever strategy, or total victory. It ended because one person chose to see a life instead of a label, because fear was answered with care, because compassion crossed a line that weapons never could. Humanity was never about being perfect. It was about refusing to become empty. It was about choosing kindness when hatred felt easier. In the darkest war the galaxy had ever known, one small light was spared, and because of that, millions more were allowed to shine. Years later, historians would still argue about the moment the war truly ended. Some pointed to the treaty signing, others to the fleet withdrawal. A few traced it back to the Peace Garden on VRA Prime, but those who knew the full story understood the truth was much smaller and much quieter. It happened in a ruined corridor under falling dust. When a tired soldier noticed something everyone else had trained themselves not to see, Aaron never called himself a hero. When asked, he always redirected the question. He spoke about how easy it is to follow orders, how natural it feels to stop seeing faces after years of fighting. He spoke about how the war had trained them all to think in terms of threats and outcomes instead of lives. "The hardest part," he once said, "wasn't breaking protocol. It was remembering who I was before the war taught me to forget." Nova grew older, stronger, wiser. He learned both languages. He learned both histories. He learned about the war not as a story of enemies and victories, but as a warning. Sometimes he visited her, sometimes Aaron visited VRA Prime. They always walked the garden together, past the crystal flowers that reflected light and colors neither species had named before. The galaxy did not become perfect. Conflicts still happened, fear still existed, but something fundamental had shifted. When commanders hesitated before firing, when medics crossed lines they once would not have, when soldiers lowered their weapons just long enough to ask a question, that was the legacy. Humanity was no longer defined by blood or origin. It was defined by restraint, by empathy, by the courage to choose compassion when fear demanded destruction. In the end, the war did not stop because everyone changed. It stopped because one person did. And sometimes, that is enough.